Eventually, she did speak. She told me, haltingly at first and then more confidently, about her dream of becoming a nurse, about her mother who cleaned houses 6 days a week to support the two of them, about the scholarship exam she was terrified of failing. I recognized something in her that I hadn't expected to recognize, something about the careful, guarded way she carried herself, the way she seemed determined not to need anyone's pity, even while quietly needing quite a lot of help. Over the following weeks, I kept showing up on Saturday mornings. Sophia and I worked through reading passages together, practiced interview questions for the scholarship committee, and slowly, without either of us really announcing it, became something like friends across a 40-year age gap and an ocean of different life experience. I found myself looking forward to those Saturday mornings in a way I hadn't looked forward to anything in a very long time. When the scholarship results were finally announced and Sophia's name was on the list, I remember she didn't react the way I expected. No jumping, no screaming, no immediate tears. She simply sat very still, as though she hadn't fully processed what she'd just heard. Then, slowly, she smiled. The same smile I'd seen the day she first read a full paragraph aloud without stumbling. Only bigger now, brighter, full of something that looked very much like hope. Her mother came to find me afterward and, before I could say much of anything, wrapped me in a long, tight hug, the kind of hug people give you when words have simply stopped being enough to carry what they're feeling. I walked home that evening through streets still loud with traffic and motorcycles and street food vendors calling out to passers-by, and something inside me felt different. Not because the city around me had changed, but because something inside me had. For years, I had been quietly searching for happiness, certain that if I could just find the right financial arrangement, the right living situation, the right routine, happiness would eventually follow. What I discovered instead, walking home that evening, was that happiness hadn't actually been the missing piece all along. Purpose had been. When Frank passed away, I believed an entire chapter of my life had simply ended. And in many ways, it had. What I didn't understand at the time was that endings and beginnings often arrive together, tangled up in each other, and you rarely recognize the beginning until you've had enough distance to look back and see it clearly. In the moment, all you can see is the ending, the loss, the empty chair across the table, the silence in a house built for more than one person. The rest, the part where a new beginning slowly reveals itself, takes far longer and far more patience than anyone tells you it will. I share all of this because I need you to understand what my life actually looked like by the time I was 74, so you can understand exactly how much was at stake on that Tuesday morning when the deposit didn't arrive. By then, I had built something I hadn't expected to build again at my age. I had a small circle of friends, both fellow expats and Filipino neighbors, who had become something closer to family. I still helped with Elena's Saturday program, though my role had grown over time to include helping several other students besides Sophia, who was thriving in her new school. I had a modest but comfortable routine: morning walks before the heat became too intense, coffee at the same small stand where they now had my order ready before I finished crossing the street, quiet evenings on my balcony watching the city lights the same way I once watched them with a knot of anxiety in my stomach, except now the feeling underneath was something closer to peace. All of it, every single piece of that hard-won life, rested on one thing: a Social Security deposit that arrived reliably, month after month, like clockwork, the one financial constant I had built my entire new existence around. And on that particular Tuesday morning, it simply wasn't there. I want to walk you through what those first hours actually felt like, because I think it's important, and because I suspect there are people listening to this who have felt something similar, even if the details of their situation are different from mine. After I'd refreshed the app for what felt like the 20th time, I made myself put the phone down and think the way I used to think when a client called me in a panic over a bookkeeping discrepancy. Panic, I always told my clients, doesn't fix a single number. Only careful, methodical thinking fixes numbers. So I made a second cup of coffee, sat back down at my little table, and forced myself to work through the problem logically instead of emotionally, even though every part of me wanted to do exactly the opposite. First, I checked whether this had happened to anyone else I knew. I sent a message to another expat friend, a retired engineer named Robert, who had also been receiving his Social Security abroad for several years. He wrote back within the hour to say his own deposit had arrived exactly on schedule, which meant this wasn't some broad, system-wide delay affecting everyone. This was something specific to me, specific to my account, and that realization, rather than comforting me, made the whole situation feel considerably worse. Second, I tried calling the Social Security Administration directly, forgetting for a moment, in my panic, about the significant time difference between Manila and the United States. It was the middle of the night back home. Nobody was going to answer a phone line in Baltimore at that hour, no matter how many times I dialed. Third, and this is the part I'm least proud of, I allowed myself, for perhaps 20 minutes, to fully imagine the worst possible outcome. I imagined my benefits had been cut off entirely. I imagined some bureaucratic error that would take months to untangle, months during which I would have no income at all, sitting alone in a foreign country with a landlord who still expected rent, and a body that, at 74, could not simply go out and find a new job the way it once could have. I imagined having to call David and admit that his worries, all those years ago, had been justified after all, that I had made a terrible mistake moving so far from everyone who loved me. I let myself sit in that fear for a while, because I think sometimes you have to actually feel a fear fully before you can start working your way calmly out of it. But eventually, the same disciplined part of my brain that had spent 38 years catching other people's errors took back control, and I made myself get up, get dressed, and start actually solving the problem instead of simply drowning in it. I spent that entire day, and much of the following one, working the problem the way I would have worked any complicated account discrepancy earlier in my career. I found the international phone number for the Social Security Administration's Federal Benefits Unit, the line specifically meant for beneficiaries living abroad, and I called during the narrow window when both time zones were awake enough for the call to make sense. I sat on hold for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably closer to 45 minutes, listening to the same looping hold music over and over, my heart rate climbing every time the music briefly paused, as though someone might be about to pick up, only for the music to start again. When a representative finally did answer, I explained my situation as clearly and calmly as I could manage, giving her my full name, my claim number, the last several digits of my Social Security number, all the identifying information I had carefully kept written down in a notebook, precisely for a moment like this one. She asked me a series of questions. Had I recently changed my mailing address? Had I recently completed, or failed to complete, a form I might not fully remember, something related to periodically confirming my continued eligibility while living overseas? Had I responded to any recent letters mailed to my address on file? And that question was the one that stopped me cold, because I suddenly remembered something I had genuinely forgotten about. Several weeks earlier, I had received an official-looking letter forwarded to me through a mail forwarding service I used, since I no longer had a permanent U.S. address of my own. The letter had required me to complete and return a form confirming my continued residency status and eligibility, a routine check the government periodically performs for beneficiaries living abroad. I remembered opening the envelope, remembered glancing at the form, and then, distracted by a minor plumbing issue in my condo that same week, setting it aside on my kitchen counter to deal with properly later. And then, in the ordinary chaos of daily life, I had simply forgotten about it entirely. The representative confirmed, gently but plainly, that my failure to return that form by its deadline had triggered an automatic, temporary suspension of my benefits, pending confirmation of my continued eligibility. It was not, she assured me, a permanent cutoff. It was not evidence of fraud or any wrongdoing on my part. It was a bureaucratic safeguard, a routine check that exists precisely to prevent the kind of fraud that sometimes occurs when beneficiaries pass away or become ineligible without anyone reporting it. But routine or not, the effect on my life in that moment was anything but routine. It meant no income for an unknown number of weeks, while the paperwork worked its way through the system. I felt something I hadn't fully felt since the week Frank died. The particular, disorienting terror of realizing that a piece of paper I hadn't even considered important could unravel an entire life I had worked so hard to rebuild. I want to tell you honestly that the following weeks were some of the hardest of my time in the Philippines, harder in some ways than that first lonely night in my condo. I completed the required form again, this time overnighting it through an expedited service, rather than trusting it to the regular mail. I called the benefits office every few days for updates, careful never to be anything other than polite, because I had learned long ago from my years managing difficult client relationships that patience and courtesy get you further with any bureaucracy than frustration ever will, even when frustration is exactly what you're feeling underneath. While I waited, I had to make some difficult adjustments. I dipped into the small emergency fund I had, thankfully, been disciplined enough to set aside during my first year abroad, precisely because some quiet, cautious part of me had never fully trusted that any single income source was completely guaranteed to continue without interruption. I am deeply grateful now for that particular piece of caution, even though at the time, setting money aside each month had felt almost unnecessary, given how comfortably my Social Security check alone had been covering my modest expenses. I also, for the first time since arriving in the Philippines, allowed myself to lean on the community I had built without fully realizing I was building it. Elena, when I mentioned what was happening, immediately offered to help however she could, even offering to lend me money without my asking, an offer I gratefully declined but never forgot. Rosario, my neighbor, began quietly leaving extra portions of whatever she'd cooked outside my door every few days, never mentioning it directly, simply making sure I had one less thing to worry about while I sorted out the rest. Even Sophia, hearing from her mother what was happening, drew me a small picture and left it taped to my door, a simple, childish drawing of the two of us sitting together at the community center, with the words, "You helped me, let us help you," written carefully underneath in her careful 12-year-old handwriting. I sat on my balcony the evening I found that drawing and cried for the second time since arriving in that country, though this time the tears felt entirely different from the ones I'd cried alone in that empty condo on my very first night. These were not tears of fear or loneliness. These were tears of something closer to gratitude, the recognition that somewhere along the way, without ever fully intending to, I had built an actual life here, a life with people in it who genuinely cared whether I was all right. It took 5 weeks in total for my benefits to be fully reinstated, along with a retroactive payment covering the period of suspension, deposited all at once in a single lump sum that felt, when it finally arrived, like the most enormous relief I had experienced in years. I remember opening my banking app that morning, half expecting another disappointment, and instead seeing the number I had been waiting for, sitting there plainly on the screen, as steady and unremarkable as it had always been, before that one Tuesday morning turned my entire understanding of security upside down. I want to tell you what I took away from those 5 weeks, because I think it matters more than the frightening details of the crisis itself. The first thing I learned is that financial security, especially the kind built around a single fixed source of income, is more fragile than most of us want to admit. No matter how carefully we've planned, no matter how many decades we spent doing the responsible thing, a single missed form, a single piece of mail set aside during a moment of distraction can unravel far more than we expect it to. I had spent an entire career warning clients about exactly this kind of vulnerability, and it still managed to catch me completely by surprise when it happened in my own life. The second thing I learned is that an emergency fund is not a luxury for people living on a fixed income abroad. It is not something you set aside only if you happen to have extra money left over after covering your regular expenses. It is, I now believe, one of the single most important financial decisions I made in my entire time in the Philippines, and I would tell anyone considering a similar move to build that cushion before anything else, even before booking the flight. The third thing I learned, and this is the one that surprised me most, is that community is not a soft, sentimental extra layered on top of a well-planned life. Community is infrastructure. It is as real and as load-bearing as any financial plan, in some ways more so, because money can disappear for reasons entirely outside your control. But the people who genuinely care about you tend to show up precisely when the money can't. I think back often to that first terrified night in my empty condo, when I believed, with total certainty, that moving to the Philippines alone at 71 years old had been a catastrophic mistake. I think about how impossible it would have seemed to that frightened, jet-lagged version of myself that 3 years later, when a real financial crisis actually did arrive, I would not face it alone in some empty apartment surrounded by strangers. I would face it surrounded by a security guard who knew my name, a neighbor who quietly left food outside my door, a fellow expat who offered me money without a second thought, and a 12-year-old girl who left me a drawing that said, more clearly than any adult ever managed to say it, that the help I had given so freely to others had come back around to hold me up when I needed it most. I am 74 years old now, sitting on the same small balcony where I once cried from loneliness and later cried from gratitude, and I can tell you honestly that I do not regret a single part of this decision. Not even the frightening 5 weeks when my income disappeared without warning. If anything, that crisis taught me something my 38 years of accounting somehow never fully taught me. That real security was never only about the number in your bank account. It is about the depth and the strength of the people standing around you when that number, even briefly, disappears. My son David flew out to visit me for the first time about 4 months after the whole ordeal was finally resolved. I remember watching his face as we walked through my neighborhood together, as Jun greeted me warmly by name at the entrance to my building, as the woman at the coffee stand had my order ready before I finished crossing the street, as Rosario waved to me from her window and called out something in Tagalog that made me laugh. I watched something shift in my son's expression. The same worry I'd heard in his voice on that very first phone call, slowly giving way to something that looked, unmistakably, like relief. "Mom," he said to me quietly, on his last evening there, sitting beside me on that same balcony where I had once felt so completely and utterly alone. "I think I finally understand why you did this." I told him I wasn't sure I had fully understood it myself when I first got on that plane. "Some decisions," I said, "you don't fully understand until years after you've already made them, until life has had enough time to prove, slowly and patiently, that you were braver than you ever gave yourself credit for being." He asked me, before he left, whether I was ever afraid that something like the Social Security scare might happen again. I told him the honest truth. Of course I was. Life abroad, life anywhere really, never comes with any guarantee against fear or crisis or sudden uncertainty. But I told him I had learned something in those 5 frightening weeks that I don't think I ever could have learned back in that quiet house in Portland, surrounded by familiar walls, but very little else. I had learned that I was stronger and far less alone than I had ever imagined I could be at 74 years old, on the other side of the world from everything I used to think of as home. These days, home doesn't look the way I once assumed it would. It isn't a house with a maple tree out front, though I still think of that tree fondly, and I suspect I always will. Home now is a small condo balcony overlooking a city that once terrified me and now simply feels like mine. It's Saturday mornings with Elena's students, Sophia's careful, determined voice growing more confident by the month. It's Rosario's cooking appearing outside my door for no particular reason at all. It's a Social Security deposit that, these days, I check calmly rather than anxiously, not because I've stopped caring whether it arrives, but because I finally understand that even if, one day, it doesn't, I am no longer facing that uncertainty by myself. If you had told me, standing frozen in that grocery store aisle in Portland 3 years ago, quietly doing anxious math over a carton of eggs, that I would one day be sitting on a balcony in Manila, at peace with myself in a way I hadn't been since long before Frank died, I don't think I would have believed you. But here I am. And if there is one thing I would want anyone listening to this to take away from my story, it is simply this. It is never too late, not at 71, not at 74, not at any age, to build a life that finally feels like it belongs to you. Even when that life includes frightening mornings when the deposit doesn't come. Especially then, perhaps, because it is often in exactly those frightening mornings that you discover who and what has truly been holding you up all along. I was 74 years old the morning the deposit didn't come. I need you to understand something about me before I tell you what happened, because I want you to know I was not a careless woman. I was not reckless. I was never the kind of person who made big decisions on a whim and hoped for the best. For 38 years, I worked as an accountant in Portland, Oregon. I balanced other people's books for a living. I caught errors that other people missed. I was the woman coworkers called when a spreadsheet didn't add up, when a client's numbers didn't make sense, when something felt wrong, but nobody could quite say why. I built my entire identity around precision, around double-checking everything twice, around never letting a single detail slip through the cracks. Before we continue, make sure you're already subscribed to this channel, and please write in the comments which country or city you're watching this from. I always read them. So when I tell you that on an ordinary Tuesday morning, in a small rented condo in Metro Manila, I woke up earlier than usual, made myself a cup of coffee the way I always did, sat down at the little table by the window, and opened my banking app to find that my Social Security deposit simply was not there. I need you to understand that this was not a woman who had failed to plan. This was a woman whose careful, well-built life had just been pulled out from under her without a single word of warning. I refreshed the screen 5 times, then 10. The number on the screen stayed exactly the same, unmoved, indifferent, as if it had no idea that it represented my entire life. I was almost 12,000 kilometers from the United States. I did not have a husband in the next room to call in and show the screen to. I did not have children living down the street who could drive over and help me sort it out. I was alone, in a country I had lived in for less than 2 years, and the only income I had in the entire world had simply, silently stopped arriving. I sat very still for a long moment, the coffee going cold in front of me, and I thought, how did I get here? Not the Philippines. I knew exactly how I'd gotten to the Philippines. I mean, how did I get to this exact moment, this exact shape of fear, at 74 years old, when I had assumed I was long past the age when life could still knock the ground out from under me like this? To explain that morning properly, I have to take you back several years, to a house in Portland that I loved, and, toward the end, resented in equal measure, depending on the day you asked me. My husband Frank and I bought that house in 1987. It was a modest 3-bedroom with a big maple tree in the front yard that turned the most extraordinary shade of orange every October, the kind of orange that made neighbors slow their cars down as they drove past. We raised our son David there. We hosted Thanksgiving there for 26 consecutive years, the table always a little too crowded, the kitchen always a little too warm, exactly the way you want a house to feel on a holiday. Frank died in that house too, in the bedroom upstairs, on a rainy February morning nearly 4 years before I ever set foot in the Philippines. Congestive heart failure, 69 years old. Here on a Sunday evening, gone by the following Friday morning. People tell you that grief moves through stages, that you pass through denial and anger and bargaining and depression, and finally, mercifully, land somewhere near acceptance. What I found is that grief doesn't care about stages at all. Grief moves into your house like an unwanted tenant, rearranges the furniture, doesn't pay rent, and doesn't leave simply because you ask it to. For the better part of a year after Frank died, I existed inside that house rather than lived in it. I kept his reading glasses on the nightstand exactly where he'd left them. I kept his coffee mug in the cabinet, the chipped one with the fishing lure painted on the side that I always meant to throw away, and somehow never did. More than once, out of pure habit, I set 2 plates at the table before catching myself and quietly putting one back in the cupboard. I want to be honest with you about the finances too, because that is really where this whole story begins, even though the loneliness came first and never fully left. Frank and I had done what we believed was everything right. We paid off the mortgage by the time we turned 60. We had a modest 401k, nothing extravagant, but enough that we believed we would be comfortable. We had Social Security coming in for both of us. We had a small life insurance policy tucked away as a cushion. On paper, we looked like a couple who had done retirement exactly the way the financial magazines tell you to do it. But paper doesn't account for a husband's sudden death cutting your household income nearly in half, while your expenses barely move. Paper doesn't account for property taxes in Portland climbing a little more every single year, while your income stays fixed in place. Paper doesn't account for a roof that needs replacing 18 months after your husband dies, or a car that finally gives out after 2 decades of faithful service, or the quiet, invisible cost of grief itself. The money you spend without really noticing, because you are not paying attention to much of anything, because you are simply trying to get through each day intact. By my 2nd year alone, I finally sat down one evening and did to my own life what I had done professionally for other people for nearly 4 decades. I opened a ledger and did the math on myself, and the math was not good. My Social Security check, combined with what remained of our savings, was going to last me, if I was careful, if nothing went wrong, if I never faced another major expense for the rest of my life, perhaps 8 more years. I was 71 at the time. 8 years would carry me to 79. I did not like thinking about what came after 79. I liked even less thinking about what might happen if something went wrong before then, which, for a woman my age living alone, felt less like a possibility and more like a statistical certainty waiting for its moment. I remember the exact instant that fear crystallized into something I could no longer push aside. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Strange how much of this story keeps circling back to Tuesdays, and I was standing in the aisle of my local grocery store, holding a carton of eggs, when I realized I was doing quiet calculations in my head. Not, do I want these eggs? Not, are these the eggs I usually buy? Just, how many dollars is this? And how many dollars do I have left? And how many days until the next check arrives? I had spent 38 years managing other people's money with total, unshakable confidence. And there I was, standing under fluorescent lights, quietly terrified of a carton of eggs. That was the moment I understood something had to change. I simply didn't yet know what that something was. The idea of the Philippines came to me almost by accident, the way so many of the most important turns in life seem to arrive, sideways, unannounced, disguised as something small and unremarkable. My neighbor 2 houses down, a retired nurse named Carol, had a brother who had moved to Cebu a few years earlier, after his own wife passed away. Carol mentioned it to me one afternoon while we were both out watering our gardens. In the offhand way you mention something that doesn't seem important at the time it's said. She told me her brother was doing well there. She said his Social Security check, which had felt uncomfortably tight back in the States, stretched further than he had ever imagined it could. She said he had a helper who came by a few times a week to assist around the house. She said he'd made real friends, actual friends, not just polite acquaintances. And then she said the thing that stayed with me longest. that he seemed happier than he had been in years. I didn't think much of it that particular day. I went back inside, made dinner for one, and went about my evening the way I usually did. But the seed had been planted whether I realized it or not, and over the following weeks, it kept working its way back into my thoughts at strange hours. Late at night, unable to sleep, I would find myself opening my laptop and typing search terms I never imagined I would type. Cost of living in the Philippines for retirees. Social security payments received abroad. Is it safe for an older woman to live alone overseas? I read forums late into the night, sometimes until 2 or 3 in the morning. I read blog posts written by other retirees, other widows and widowers, other people who had reached the exact crossroads I had reached and decided to do something about it, instead of simply watching their savings shrink year after year inside a house too big and too quiet for one person. I want to be very clear that this was not an impulsive decision. I am not built for impulsive decisions. 38 years of accounting does not leave much room for impulse. I spent nearly 4 months researching before I ever booked a single flight. I read about visas, the tourist visa that would let me enter and extend my stay while I figured things out, and later, the retiree visa so many long-term expats eventually applied for. I read about healthcare, about which cities had reliable hospitals, about the cost of a 1-bedroom apartment in Metro Manila compared to what I paid in property taxes alone back in Portland. I read about safety, about common scams, about all the things well-meaning people would later warn me about once I finally told them what I was planning to do. And believe me, they warned me. My son David, who lived 4 hours away in Seattle and called me faithfully every Sunday evening, was the hardest to convince. I remember the phone call where I first told him I was seriously considering the move. There was a long silence on his end of the line, the kind of silence that tells you exactly how someone feels before they've said a single word out loud. "Mom," he finally said, "you're 71 years old. You've never lived outside the Pacific Northwest your whole life. And you want to move to a country you've never even visited, on the other side of the world, by yourself?" I told him I understood his concern. I told him I had done the research. I told him this was not reckless, that I had thought it through more carefully than almost any decision I'd made in my adult life. He wasn't convinced that night, and honestly, he wasn't fully convinced for a long time afterward. But he also knew his mother well enough to know that once I had made up my mind about something, after doing my due diligence, there wasn't much room left to change it. My friends were gentler in how they expressed their doubt, but the doubt was there all the same. A few of them gave me the particular smile people give you when they think you're making a mistake, but don't want to say so directly to your face. One of my closest friends from church, a woman named Patricia I had known for over 20 years, finally asked me outright one afternoon over lunch, "Dorothy, why would a woman your age move halfway around the world by herself?" At the time, I didn't have a perfect answer for her. I said something about the cost of living, about stretching my Social Security further, about wanting some kind of change. All of that was true. But underneath the practical reasons was something harder to put into words, something I didn't fully understand myself until much later. I wasn't only running from a math problem. I was running from a house that echoed. I was running from a life that had quietly shrunk, room by room, since Frank died, until it felt like I was living inside a single corner of what used to be a much bigger, fuller home. I sold the house in Portland 8 months after that grocery store moment with the eggs. I would like to tell you that selling it was a purely practical decision, but that would not be true. Standing in the empty living room on my last day there, after the movers had taken away everything except the maple tree outside the window, which of course they could not take with them, I cried harder than I had since the week Frank died. I cried for the plates I used to set for 2. I cried for 26 Thanksgivings. I cried for the version of my future I had once quietly assumed would simply continue in that house until I was very old, surrounded by grandchildren, the way I had always pictured it without ever really examining the picture too closely. But grief, I was slowly learning, does not require you to stay still. Sometimes the most respectful thing you can do for a life you loved is to carry it forward into a new one, rather than let it calcify into a museum you're too afraid to ever leave. I landed in Manila on a humid evening, carrying 2 suitcases and a level of anxiety I hadn't felt since my very first day at my very first accounting job, nearly 49 years earlier. I had booked a 1-bedroom condo in advance, in a neighborhood that had come recommended by several of the expat forums I'd spent months reading. The taxi ride from the airport felt like driving through a dream that wasn't quite mine yet. Tall glass towers, streets full of motorcycles and jeepneys, neon signs in languages I couldn't read, the humid night air pressing against the windows, even with the air conditioning running at full strength. The driver glanced at me in the rearview mirror at one point and asked if this was my first time in the Philippines. I told him it was. He smiled and told me I would like it here. I remember hoping, more than believing, that he was right. That first night in the condo, after he had carried my suitcases up and driven off into the traffic, I stood alone in a small, unfamiliar apartment and felt a loneliness so complete it nearly took my breath away. The apartment was exactly as advertised. Clean, modern, a small kitchen, a narrow balcony overlooking the city lights stretching out in every direction. It should have felt like the beginning of an adventure. Instead, sitting on the edge of an unfamiliar bed, still dressed in my travel clothes, still gripping my passport like some kind of life preserver, it felt like I had made an enormous, irreversible mistake. I want to be honest with you. There were several nights in that first month when I lay awake in the dark, wondering whether I should simply book a return flight and go back to whatever remained of my old life. Nobody in that entire city of more than 13 million people knew my name. Nobody was expecting to see me the next morning. If something had happened to me in that apartment, it might have been days before a single soul noticed. But slowly, almost without my realizing it was happening at all, things began to shift. It started with small things, the kind of things you don't recognize as significant until much later, looking back. The security guard downstairs, a young man named Jun, began greeting me by name after only a week, something that had somehow never once happened in the 20 years I lived in my old Portland neighborhood. The woman who ran a small coffee stand near my building learned exactly how I took my coffee after my 3rd visit and had it ready before I finished placing my order by my 2nd week. A neighbor 2 floors down, an older Filipina woman named Rosario, knocked on my door one afternoon holding a plate of food she said she'd made too much of and simply told me, "You are new here. Eat." She didn't wait for permission. She just handed me the plate, smiled warmly, and went back to her own apartment, as though this were the most natural thing in the world, which, in that building, it apparently was. I sat with that plate of food for a long time before I finally ate it, turning the whole moment over in my mind, thinking about how strange it was that a stranger's small, unasked-for kindness could feel so much larger than it had any right to feel. Over the following months, my Social Security check, the same amount I had once watched shrink helplessly against Portland's rising cost of living, began to feel entirely different in this new context. Rent for my 1-bedroom condo was a fraction of what I had once paid in property taxes alone. Groceries cost noticeably less. A visit to the doctor, when I needed one for a minor issue during my 2nd month there, cost only a small fraction of what the same visit would have cost me back home, even accounting for the private insurance I had purchased before leaving the United States. For the first time in nearly 3 years, I went an entire week without doing anxious mental math over the price of a carton of eggs. But I want to be careful here, because I don't want to make it sound like the money was the whole story, because it truly wasn't. The money bought me breathing room. What actually changed my life was something else entirely. About 2 months into my stay, I was invited by another expat I'd met at a small gathering, a retired teacher named Elena, who had been living in the Philippines for almost 6 years by then, to help with a weekend program she ran for local students, mostly conversational English practice for children preparing for scholarship exams. I almost said no, not because I didn't want to help, but because some quiet, stubborn part of me wasn't sure anyone actually needed me for anything anymore. That particular uncertainty had followed me around since the day Frank died. When you spend decades being someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's steady financial backbone, it turns out to be surprisingly difficult to figure out who you are once nobody seems to need anything from you at all. I said yes anyway, mostly because Elena was persistent, and I didn't have a good enough excuse ready. That first Saturday morning, walking into a small community hall with plastic chairs and a whiteboard propped against the wall, I had no idea it would become one of the most important mornings of my entire life. That was where I met a 12-year-old girl named Sophia. She was quiet, serious, the kind of child who listens far more than she speaks, who studies a room carefully before deciding whether it's safe to say anything at all. I was paired with her for reading practice, and for the first 10 minutes, she barely looked up from the page in front of her. I didn't push. I had spent enough years managing anxious, overwhelmed clients to know that sometimes the kindest thing you can do is simply sit quietly beside someone until they decide, in their own time, that it's safe to speak.